And once we have wrapped our whole application in auth0 provider, now of course I would want to set up my user context. Now I have to be honest though, once we set up this auth provider, technically you don't have to set up the user context. I just set it up because we already had structure for all the context. So I thought that it's just going to make sense if we do it in this case. But keep in mind that when it comes to auth0, you can just use the hook because all the information is going to be available in this hook. So if you have only one place, for example, in an application when you would want to use the authentication, you can simply import the hook and then just check the values. It's also doable. But in my case, of course, I will set up my user context and then wrap the application because I think that we already have structure for that. So we might as well do it with a user as well. Just keep in mind, technically, if you have only one place and you don't want to reuse it in multiple places, you can just use the hook. It's pretty convenient since remember, we are already wrapping the application anyway in our auth provider. So where I have the user context, before I set anything up, of course, in the index.js, I also would want to add it to my render. So where we have auth provider in between the products provider and user provider, we're just going to go with user and then provider here. Now, of course, I need to set it up in the bottom as well. So in between products and auth provider, we set up our user provider. And then again, if we take a look at the docs, keep on scrolling, notice this is the hook that they provide. And these are some of the values that we can get. If you remember in a previous application, we used is loading. Now in this case, I will show you the prop and I'll show you the values and all of that. But the way our app works right now, we actually don't need it. So in this application, in this project, we won't use is loading, but we did use in the previous one. So if you want to see exactly how it works and why it is important, then of course I would suggest going to the previous project. But in this case, we were able to create our app without it. So we have our hook, and then of course we just need to invoke it and then grab some values out of the data that is getting back. So I'm going to navigate back to my user context, and I'm going to hop here where I have the actual component, and we'll just set up our destructuring. So we're getting the object back, the data object, and then I already know which properties I'm looking for. And again, if you want to double check with docs, you can definitely do so. But I already know that I would want to invoke the use auth0 hook. And then the props or the data that I would want to get back is authenticated. That essentially is going to be a flag. Then we have a login with redirect. So this is a function that performs login functionalities. Then of course we also have a logout function and we have a user. So this is going to let us know whether we have a user and what are the credentials for the user, as well as is loading. Like I said, in this case, we won't use it, but I still would want to show you what values you will see. And then, of course, I'm passing in the value. So that's awesome. But I would want to set up the use effect just so we can see the values. So eventually there's going to be a tiny state value over here for the user. And since I would want us to be on the same page, I will set up the use effect and I will invoke it every time the is authenticated changes. And I simply would want to log some data. So I'm going to say log user, and maybe let's add here a string as well. I'll say user, and let's copy and paste. And by the way, I should have probably set up here template string and say user. And as you can see, I'm just logging the user that is coming from auth0. And I'll do the same thing here. So let me delete this line here and I'll copy and paste. Essentially, it's going to be 3 logs. One is going to be for the user. Then we'll say is authenticated over here. And of course, this is going to be the value again that is coming from my hook. And lastly, I would just want to show you the is loading. So in this case, I'll select both of them. Is loading. And of course, for time being, remember that these should all be false, meaning, of course, the loading might be different, but for the user and is authenticated, this should return false because we haven't logged in. But when it comes to value, now I would want to nicely pass down some of the functions. So again, I'll set up my JavaScript object and I would want to pass down login function, logout function, and eventually there's going to be a user in a state, which I'm going to create in a second. So let's go with login with redirect. So we're passing this down to the context. We're also passing a logout functionality. And then, like I said, let's set up a state value. So in this case, I'm not going to set up a reducer because essentially there's only one value. And I'm going to call this my user, just so it's different than the user that we're getting back from auth0. So we're not confused. And of course, I'm going to go with set my user. That is my function because I will invoke it here in the use effect. And by default, I'll use my use state and we'll just set it equal to null. And then down in the value, I'll also pass in my user. And once we have a setup for user context, then of course, we will go to one of the components that we'll need the function for the logout and login, and we'll test it out. And then next video, we'll set up our user and the functionality where at least we can show or hide some elements or components based on whether we have logged in or we're still logged out.